In a quiet corner of an American suburb stood an old movie theater. Built in the 1970s, the building exuded a faded grandeur. The neon sign flickered faintly. Starlight Cinema. With sleek modern theaters dominating the city, nobody bothered to visit this relic anymore. Yet, tonight, 4 individuals were headed toward the dimly lit entrance of this seemingly forgotten theater. Rachel tugged at her black leather jacket, nervously fiddling with a bag of candy in her hand. She always tried to keep her composure, but tonight, an inexplicable unease gnawed at her. Beside her was Johnny, wearing a worn-out varsity jacket, his usual carefree demeanor on full display. It was Johnny who'd found the place on an internet forum. "Cult Classics Night," he'd said. Despite her doubts, Rachel followed him, as she always had since they were kids. Their bond was unshakable, even if this particular outing made her skin crawl. Elsewhere, Taylor clutched her bag tightly as she glanced around the lobby. She wasn't entirely sure why she'd agreed to come. Maybe it was Chris, the confident, charismatic guy she'd just started dating, who had convinced her. "It'll be fun," he'd assured her with his signature grin. But as Taylor stepped into the cold, dimly lit building, her instincts whispered otherwise. The group exchanged uncertain glances as they stepped inside the theater. Rachel took a few cautious steps forward and surveyed the room. The seats were old and tattered, the red velvet worn thin and frayed in places. Some seats had stuffing peeking through. Large speakers sat ominously in the corners, more like relics than functional equipment. At the back of the room loomed the projection booth, its small window barely visible in the shadows. Only a few dim lights illuminated the room, casting a faint yellow glow. "This place is weird," Taylor whispered. Chris chuckled. "It's just old school. Relax. Places like this have their charm." Rachel and Johnny settled in the middle row, while Chris and Taylor opted for seats farther back. The film was about to start, yet the theater was eerily empty. At first, this privacy felt like a bonus, but as the lights dimmed, plunging the room into total darkness, the silence took on a suffocating weight. The projector hummed to life, casting a flickering black and white image on the screen. But instead of a movie, the screen displayed a grainy clip of an old train moving along deserted tracks. The sound was conspicuously absent. No rumbling wheels, no background noise, just an unsettling quiet. "What is this? Is the movie starting or not?" Rachel whispered. Johnny shrugged. "Maybe it's a trailer," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. From the back, Taylor leaned forward. "That train, it's not moving," she murmured. Chris gave her a skeptical look. "Of course it is. The projector's running." But Taylor was sure. The train's wheels didn't turn. It just slid forward, endlessly repeating the same stretch of track. Suddenly, a low hum emanated from the speakers. It wasn't music or dialogue, but a distorted murmur, like muffled voices just out of earshot. Rachel stiffened and glanced at Johnny. "What's that sound?" she asked. Johnny frowned. "Probably just the old sound system. Don't worry." Taylor shivered as a faint breeze brushed against her legs. She glanced under her seat and froze. For a moment, she thought she saw a shadow darting between the rows. "Chris, is someone there?" she whispered urgently. Chris glanced around but forced a chuckle. "Don't be ridiculous. We're alone." As the train entered a dark tunnel on the screen, the image faded to black. At that moment, Rachel heard a faint creak from the back rows. It sounded like something, or someone, moving. "I heard something," she whispered. Johnny shook his head. "It's nothing. We're letting our imaginations run wild." But Chris and Taylor were starting to notice things too. The seat behind Taylor creaked slightly as though someone were leaning on it. Chris, meanwhile, caught a glimpse of the projection booth. Behind the glass, a shadowy figure loomed. Small and hunched, it didn't move. Chris's heart pounded in his chest. Rachel stood abruptly. "I don't like this. Let's go," she said. Johnny reached for her arm. "Relax. It's just an old theater," he insisted, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his words. The murmuring from the speakers deepened into an unsettling drone. On the screen, the train reappeared, but now its windows were filled with ghostly faces. Blurry and indistinct, the faces seemed to press against the glass. Rachel's breath hitched as one of the faces turned directly toward her. "Is this some kind of prank?" Rachel yelled, but no one could answer. Johnny suddenly felt movement beneath his seat. He leaned down to check. "There's something down here," he shouted. The lights in the theater flickered violently. The projector stopped, yet the screen remained illuminated, glowing with an unnatural light. Shadows began to pool around the edges of the room, flowing like liquid between the seats. Chris and Taylor bolted for the exit only to find the door was gone. In its place was a blank wall. Rachel and Johnny backed toward the rear of the theater. "Is this a dream?" Rachel whispered, her voice trembling. Johnny held her close but kept his eyes fixed on the projection booth. The shadowy figure was no longer there. It had stepped out and merged with the creeping shadows in the room. The shadows weaved silently between the rows. The droning hum in the speakers gave way to a low, monotonous thrum. Suddenly, bold text appeared on the screen. "Stay for the next showing." Rachel's scream echoed through the silent cinema as the theater plunged into complete darkness. The next morning, passers-by noticed that Starlight Cinema remained locked, its doors sealed shut. No one in the town knew what had happened the night before, but a new sign had been added to the theater's marquee. "Next showing, tomorrow night." And inside, someone, or something, was still watching.